So let's talk about automation solutions. So what is the best solution and bang for your buck? We've lost the Gartner quadrant now for automation tools. So how do we decide which tool to go for? So what I wanted to kind of talk about is kind of the different entry levels of how you can get involved with automation tools at an enterprise scale without having to worry about which tool and the associated costs. So let's get started. So what you're trying to automate, is it just a mobile app? Then there's Appium. If it's just a web browser, yeah, we can go with Selenium. But I like to think enterprise organizations have more than just browsers. They have APIs, messaging buses, database layers, all not covered by Selenium. I started with the idea of banal frameworks, or either maybe your favorite automation framework sucks, because it does. It doesn't matter how much time you spend on it, you could be spending your time somewhere else adding more value. So you've got to think, what's the right solution for that right moment of time? Because the tools and technology is going to change. However, the investment you make in the business logic and the abstract layer is really important. Now, don't get me started with BDD and TDD and ATDD. Executable specifications are just, in essence, more Notepad. So, if you have to manage the entity which you're doing, then it kind of defeats the point. Yes, it's human readable, but you're much better off investing in things like model-based testing than you are things like Gherkin scripts. And given when, then, it's still not that clear exactly what you're doing. So you've got to think about the whole stack. Well, what is the whole stack? Well, let's start with the engine. The engine needs to be flexible enough to support packaged applications, Kafka, Neo4j, knowledge graphs, any of the AI platforms that you're doing with TeslaFlow. It needs to be more than just a one-trick pony. It can't just be Selenium to rule the world. And I think this is where we've all got to get out of this habit of thinking that open source is free, because it isn't. As soon as you spend 10 minutes of time doing something with it, it's not free, because your time costs money. So you need to work out, well, is this just a throwaway thing? You know, maybe it's a learning opportunity for you to kind of learn a new technology. And, you know, your developers are writing in Python, JavaScript, or something else. And therefore you want to get involved and you want to really start looking at doing test-driven development. And you're at more of the component level. And you're using things like Wireshark and WireMock or something. Okay, fine. You know, if that's the case, then yeah, get your coding boots off and start coding. But that's not always the case. For most organizations, they're thinking about scale, they're thinking about continuous testing, they're thinking about DevOps. So you have to think about what the goal is of automation. Are you going to fire and forget just a couple of runs and then, you know, it's probably added its value, and then maybe the app's changing so much you've got to throw it away? But that's not always the case. Usually you're looking at building something that you can build to enable continuous testing, that when something builds you can do some testing against it. Build test, that ultra fast feedback loop. Of course, that's the big value point, and that's where everyone is trying to get to. But along that journey are challenges. Let's call them routes or roads, where you've got to take different routes to some different solutions. You might be using Jenkins for your CI/CD pipeline. You might be using ADO or something which is a bit more sophisticated. You might be building out into some kind of KA infrastructure, platform as code, terraforming. And I guess that's where you have to work out, how do you integrate with that? I usually start by saying, you know, if you're in an Oracle stack, use Java. If you're in a Microsoft stack, use C#, and, you know, keep with the stack which everyone else is developing on. You know, that seems to be the first hurdle that most organizations seem to miss, is you should try and keep in the language which everyone else is doing. But at the same time, your test adapter or your execution adapter might not be written in that language, and it doesn't really matter. You can swap those, they're interchangeable, the technology is interchangeable, and as soon as something better comes along, you can just hook into it. Of course, you know, the abstraction layer and how you decide to structure the automation is important, especially if you're thinking long term. And we all know the problem with fragile automation. And in a way, that's caused half the problems. People have lost confidence in automation and the value of what automation can bring. Because about 30% of organizations are delivering automated testing. And that number's pretty small. And I'm sure they've all had a little go with the automation snake oil, which is, you know, that automation is the solution. But automation isn't for testing. As we kind of said before, this automation is across the pipeline. If you look at the ops dev approach and you look at those orchestration platforms, they've been around for a long time. They don't just throw away that automation. All that stuff that's running organizations today in the IT operation management space is built to last and built to scale. And then we've got RPA tools, which we covered off last time, which again have some great agility around business applications, whether it be your SAPs, your Salesforce, your, you know, Appiums and low code development platforms. All that stuff is there and it's great. So what are we saying? Well, if you're just thinking about running it for just your team, in the same way that organizations run things like Agile in little pockets which work, then that's okay. But really, you should be thinking about how do we create enterprise grade automation solutions that will last the test of time. To do that, you need to think about it in the way that I've been talking about automation maturity models since the early 90s with people like Dorothy. You know, you start off by accelerating, demonstrating the value of what automation can do. Then you have to step up to the next level. It has to be sustainable, it has to be manageable. It must be able to run in some kind of CI/CD pipeline. And then you want to reduce that maintenance, right? You want to get to level 3, level 4, where you're starting to get some real benefit from the automation, but you're also scaling it. You're scaling it into other parts of the business, which can leverage those tools and technologies. And I think that's the whole point. The whole point is these are tools and technologies, and therefore it's not just testing, it's operations, it's the business. So we think about things like Power Automate, UiPath, and then we think about every other day tools that have been built into the OS from day zero. We have to leverage all of those things. PowerShell, your Bash shell scripts, all that stuff is great artifacts, and you should look at reusing it. You'll find that there's a lot already there in your organization, whether it be shims and stubs at a low level, maybe in your component tests, all the way up to what the business are using in the operations landscape. So I think you've got to start with the question of what are we trying to achieve, and where is this going to be used within our organization at a higher conversation, not just your team or on your own or in a silo. We need to break those silos down and look at the real benefit of using automation across the organization. So organization-wide automation or enterprise automation. And of course, we want to go one step further, and we want to use intelligent automation. We want it to be self-healing. We want it to fix those DOM references that are broken. Of course, that's great. Using fuzzy logic and regex, whatever you're using to build in some level of maintainability. But I think there's more to it. With computer vision, OpenCV, and tools that are out there that sit in that kind of visual testing space, we can do a lot more than just assertions on elements that exist within an application layer. We can do stuff at the data layer. We've got tools like Mitsu that are starting to allow us to look at traffic, you know, on Kafka, or messages before it hits, you know, the consumer and the producers. So we've got the messaging layer, the ESB, what we used to have with things like TIBCO and how we'd inject messages onto there. We're now into a very chatty API economy with, you know, microservices where REST and lack of things like Swagger specs are kind of killing us in the testing landscape, because we're kind of used to accepting less and less information about what the system is supposed to do. And I think that's one of the starting points. We have to start explaining to people how you make it automation ready, how you add those capabilities, that hooks into those systems, and even open up things like APIs to understand what they're doing from a testing point of view. So that open testing API landscape is the future.